We'll start. So I'm really pleased to introduce David Langemo.
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 You'll get it one of these
Langemo.
days. We've only known each other for months, Kathy. I'm
Yeah.
just kidding.
But we were connected with through a mutual friend, and I was really fascinated by his recent studying into destructive leadership and what's the kind of ripple effect and through a system when we have somebody who's bringing those characteristics into our organizations or boards or community groups or whatever. And so I'm really fascinated to hear what he has learned in his dissertation work, but also his current application as he's been speaking and sharing his knowledge widely in various groups. So I would like to hand it off to you, David, and he's going to be our provocateur for our conversation today.
I like
Thank
that
you,
title.
David.
That's fun. You're welcome. Happy to be here. Hi, everybody. Is anyone from outside the U.S. then? Oh my gosh, Catherine, where are you from?
Oh, I'm from Michigan, but I live in Switzerland.
Switzerland. And Shemrit?
It's Shimrit.
Shemrit.
And I'm in London, UK.
Fascinating. And Frank?
I'm in the Netherlands.
That's what I was going to guess from your last name. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Exciting.
Thank you.
Where in the Netherlands? My daughter lives in Utrecht.
Oh, I live in Wassenaar, The Hague, so not far.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
Well, nothing is far in the Netherlands.
No, that's true.
That's true. Yeah. Oh, that's lovely. Today happens. Oh, Jackie, you're from out of the States too.
Yeah, I'm in Nice, France.
In where?
In Nice, in France.
Oh, France. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Lovely. I have a lovely friend outside of Paris, so which I love. Well, thrilled that you're all here and all of you Americans also. That's just great. I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota, so North Central. In the plains, if any of you have ever been here before. Today happens to be National Talk Like Yoda Day, but I will not do that for this presentation, just in case. Heidi, you're in Minneapolis too. Well, lovely. We should do coffee. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, I am a pastor's kid, and so I'm thrilled to be talking in front of a computer like this for a change instead of behind a podium. Sometimes if I'm behind a podium, I feel too much like Dad, as if I'm going to read the Bible or something. So this is much better. But this is the first time I'm presenting online, as I was telling Kathy earlier today. I usually do these things in person. I went to Concordia University in St. Paul for both my undergrad and my master's. So I've got an undergrad in music education. I taught music in the public schools for a number of years. My master's is in organizational management. And then I'm here to talk to you today about my doctoral journey that I was on. I live in, excuse me, South Minneapolis with my husband, Drew, and I have a dog and a cat that will interrupt me at some point. And Drew and I love to travel. This past January, we were in Jamaica, and in November, we were in 5 different islands in the Caribbean. And if you haven't been there, we were in Istanbul last July for a few weeks, and Turkey is astounding. It's a beautiful country. So those are a little bit about me. So what I do is I go out and I talk about my doctoral project that I worked on. I've been in nonprofits for about 20 years or so in education, and then most recently in the Alzheimer's Association. And I got my doctorate a little over a year ago, May 17th of 2023. And my background is in, I'm kind of a computer geek. But what happened over COVID is we lost a lot of people in my Alzheimer's chapter here, which is the Minnesota, North Dakota chapter. And so I ended up taking on the roles of operations and DEI and finance and HR, all of those things. Regardless, my plan, once I've got my doctorate, was to go out and lead an IT team at a nonprofit somewhere because I'm a senior database manager and I'm used to doing database work. But a couple of days after getting my doctorate, one of my professors sent me a note saying, David, your research was astounding and nobody else is talking about this. So you should get out and consider talking, letting people hear about your research and what you did. And so this is the exciting part of the day, you guys. We're going to talk about destructive leaders. I don't know if Kathy's told you or not, but my research was I interviewed nonprofit board members across the United States who volunteered to talk to me about destructive leaders and how they handled them. Has anyone ever dealt with a destructive leader before? And I'm really, really sorry if you have. And if you don't mind, I would love to turn this into a facilitated discussion where I get your opinions and your thoughts and maybe even your stories if you feel safe enough to share them, because I think you're all friends. But don't listen to me talk for almost an hour. That'll be too boring. So to start off with a definition of a destructive leader, can anyone make a guess? What's the difference between a bad leader and a destructive leader?
Well, a destructive leader doesn't help people be their best selves. They make people smaller. They make people less successful. They don't help people get to their optimal potential.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you, Heidi.
Sounds it's also very toxic, the environment. The relationships are all completely broken and individuals are destroyed.
Yes, absolutely, Frank. There is a difference between the two. A bad leader can just be an inept leader, somebody who's not very good at leading. Maybe they're having a bad day. A destructive leader needs to have at least three things. They need to have repetitive behavior. So their destructive behavior isn't a one-time thing. It continues on. It's systemic. It's a part of their person. It's part of their character, their personality. And not always, but most of the time, it's intentional. They are on purpose being a destructive leader. Rarely, but sometimes you can be an accidental destructive leader. I know that might sound weird, but for instance, if you are in an organization that is doing poorly, you may develop destructive leadership behaviors that just stick with you. It's a rare occurrence, but for the most part, you've got those three things pretty solidly. Does that make sense? Yeah, Heidi.
I'm just really curious about that intentional, because like, who would intentionally do this? Be
Oh,
destructive. Who would intend? I mean, I get that there's some people, but is it that common? I don't know. It just intentional. That bugs me.
Yeah, what
Yeah.
do you mean by intentional? Is it just, do they intend to do harm, or do they intend to behave in certain ways without realizing they're doing harm?
no, they know they are doing the harm they're doing. They completely know. If you are, let's say somebody who is gaslighting, they gaslight on a regular basis. They do it on purpose in a manipulative way, and they scheme for how it can be used the best. Any type of manipulation, belittling, a narcissist.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Does that
you
help,
know,
Heidi? Does that make sense? A little bit.
Yeah.
But it is
When I think
bothersome.
about the destructive leaders I've known, I'm not sure it was intentional, or if they, so anyway, that's just what gives me pause,
Yes.
Yeah.
David, just to
Yeah.
clarify the systemic, can you say that a little bit more? It's systemic. So there's one
Yes.
person, but its impacts are.
In this case, we're using the term systemic to mean that it is a part of their person. It's a part of their character. It's not
okay.
necessarily a it's a trait, if you will.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Got it. Whew.
Oh, Machiavellian, great word. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. So destructive leaders, when we think about them, the reason that I go out and talk about this, and when I do talk about this, I don't, oh, hi, Julie. I don't talk about the psychology of destructive leaders, even though there's a lot of research on that. I don't talk about the religion aspect or the political aspect. It's all about the business aspect because my degree is in business administration. So how does a destructive leader hurt the company from a business standpoint, which is usually the financial bottom line? And the reason I cut out the others is because the research would have just taken too much time, even though there is a lot of research out there. There's a lot of research out there on destructive leaders in educational fields, higher education, elementary education, principals, all of those things. There's a lot of research on destructive leaders in the military, and I had to stay away from that, even though it's really juicy. So I really stuck with the business aspect because it costs almost $24 billion annually through employee turnover and lack of production due to destructive leader behavior. Can any of you make a guess, and some of you probably even know this a lot, that how much does it cost to replace a person who has left your organization, to get them back up and running to where the other person was working?
Well,
At
1
least
year's
100K.
of salary. Yeah.
Yeah, lots of different answers. That's great. Anywhere between 30 and 100% of the person's income. So if somebody was working for a nonprofit for $100,000, it could cost them another $100,000 just to get another person up and running into that same position. It's far too expensive. Nonprofits can't afford that. For-profits can't afford that. Yeah. Oh, good question, Shamreed. The religious aspect. Let me tell you. So I had so much fun interviewing the board members, although I must admit, I was surprised by how many of them were crying during the interviews because they are still full of fear and trauma. How many of them regretted not reporting the illegal activity that some of the destructive leaders have been doing. Just fascinating. And we're talking about anywhere from small t trauma to capital T trauma. So small t being manipulative and belittling, to capital T fist fights and guns being drawn. All kinds of trauma these board members dealt with. And in some cases, the board members were on the board of directors at a church, and the pastor was a destructive leader. Isn't that great? Speaking as a pastor's kid, I just love that kind of stuff. So fascinating. Oh, Jackie, that's the one question I can't answer. What's the percentage of destructive leaders in business? There's no way to get that answer because you'd have to have people volunteer as being destructive leaders, and many of them simply won't. Great question. Yes, go ahead, Mary Ellen.
Oh, okay, you got it.
Excuse me, I did my master's at St. Kate's
Oh.
and it was in organizational leadership. And one aspect that I considered was what I called the dark side of leadership.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And I did not use the terminology, or I should say it a different way. I did not acknowledge the dark side or the destructive side as being a leader, because what I was looking at was, what is the process of leadership? What is the development of a leader, and how then does that contribute to the design? Because I think within each of us, there is a capability and a capacity for darkness and destruction in a leadership function.
Yeah.
However, if we are genuinely, deeply considering ourselves to be a leader, then that will be addressed in the process of an individual's growth or development.
Mm-hmm.
And it will ultimately be acknowledged and hopefully bring us into a more whole attention to how we practice our leadership.
Hopefully, yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So I was looking at it from a somewhat different perspective, but I think it addresses differently the same questions, concerns, and issues
Yeah.
that Shimrit was asking, you know, where is it necessarily religious? I did not consider it to be so. I considered it more from a holistic perspective. I think it concerns me in our leadership practices that we do not acknowledge that as human beings, as we grow and develop, our own capacity for lack of perfection or the darkness and destruction that we are capable of. And I think it contributes, in my mind, greatly to your discussion of here I'm looking at the outcomes, and I was trying to better understand the process and the growth of what it really means to develop and practice.
Yeah. Mhm. Thank you, Mary Ellen. I love that. I would love to read your paper.
It's very, very old. And it generated a lot of controversy because at the time it was not a consideration of leadership.
Yeah.
And it took me 9 months to have the topic approved, but eventually it was. And I'm finding that it's obviously coming up more and more. So I was pretty cold and lonely back in those days.
Understandable. Well, let me tackle that whole distinction between destructive and dark leadership. So my original goal when I was getting my doctorate was I wanted to do research on where is love in leadership, because I believe love can be used as a tool in leadership very effectively.
Yes.
In fact, I've got a book in my library right now called Love is Just Damn Good Business. Pardon my language. So highly recommend that book if you haven't read it yet. But I couldn't do that because the school determined that love is not quantitatively measurable, even though all of you could probably argue that it is. And so I had to do something different. So since my specialization was in leadership, I was just paging through what are some things that'll inspire me. And I was reading through all the different types of leadership, and I came across this phrase, destructive leadership, which is a very valid style of leadership. It's not something that I made up. It's been around since 1938, pre-World War II. And it was first mentioned in a book from a guy in India, of all places, where he was talking about the destructive leadership happening there. And so since then, there's been little research on it. You know, when back in the 30s, 40s, there wasn't much research, even though there could have been a lot of great things written about destructive leadership in the 40s, right? World War II. But not much happened. And even since then, people will shy away. They're uncomfortable. Like Heidi was talking about, makes you uncomfortable to even hear the phrase destructive leadership. To be quite honest, it's sometimes hard for me to get into a place to talk about destructive leadership because people don't want to be associated with that at all. And I've been asked to even soften it to dark leadership or something else. And perhaps it's my Scandinavian stubbornness. I'm not quite sure, but at the moment, you know, you can't soften depression or cancer or suicide. Those are real traumatic things, just like this is a real traumatic thing. Destructive leadership is a real thing. And since it's got the word leadership after it in the title, it's got followers. There are people who do follow destructive leaders. So it's a very valid type of leadership. But great comment, Mary Ellen. Does that pose a little bit more light in it too?
Yes, I think it does. I would just, again, and I'm still wrestling with all of this because now I'm working on my PhD. So it's coming into play yet again differently, but nonetheless, it's there. However, what I want to also distinguish is this would require another whole topic of conversation on how, or the qualities, how we are considering the developmental process, and the acknowledgement or the ability to acknowledge what it means to be whole or become whole as a leader. I think that's a critical consideration in how we determine, is there such a thing actually as destructive leadership? Is there such a thing as the dark side? And that's somewhat cultural, somewhat spiritual. Americans have a hard time, particularly culturally, to believe their leaders can be anything but perfect. There is no sexuality, there is no immorality. We love perfection. And so when someone makes a mistake, we're very unwilling to allow for balance, to create, as Kathy has referred to on more than one occasion, that opportunity to have fun making mistakes, to participate in the imperfection of developing our organizations or developing ourselves.
Yes.
It's a struggle to acknowledge who we are and that it's okay to have those moments of destruction or to have those moments of violating the norms of our organizations. It may not be destructive, but it perhaps can heavily influence.
Yes, absolutely. I feel like you and I could talk for hours, Marianne.
I think it would
I
be
love
fun.
that.
Yeah,
We
it
would have a
be a lot of
blast.
fun. Yeah.
Oh, goodness. Well, let me move on since we're already almost halfway through, and I just love all of this. Here are 3 different themes that came across with the interviews with the board members. Fear and anxiety was one theme. Obviously, there's a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety surrounding what happens as a result of the destructive leadership. The second theme was the creation and enforcement of written policies. There are simply too many organizations that don't have the written policies for how to deal with a destructive leader or even how to deal with conflict. And then third was the loss of productivity and retention. Here is the monetary problem, the organizational business problem, that we're losing money in productivity and employee retention. So I cannot speak for those outside the US, but in the US, do any of you have a guess? How many employees work in the nonprofit sector?
A lot. I have no
There's 12 million employees approximately in the US who work for the nonprofit sector. And then there's approximately 63 million volunteers in the nonprofit sector. So between those two numbers together, we're looking at 75 million people who could potentially be subjugated to destructive leadership behavior. It's a lot. It's a lot. So it's a fascinating topic. Isn't this a fun topic? I could talk about it for hours. For those of you who have dealt with a destructive leader before, let me tell you my story first, and then I would love to hear another story or two if anyone is willing to share. I worked for an organization where my supervisor, who got along with me okay, but across the hall was a woman, and he would continually yell at this woman every day. And sometimes he would yell at her while sitting at the desk in his office so that she could hear him while she's sitting at the desk in her office, which obviously meant that I could hear him yelling at her, and there were more offices down the hallway with more people in them, and we could all hear him yelling at her. And none of us did a thing. We simply didn't know what to do. And this agrees with the gap in practice. When I was interviewing with the board members, people don't know how to intervene, who should intervene, when should the intervention happen. That's what's missing. We just don't know how to intervene. Years later, I got together with this woman and had lunch, and I apologized to her. I said, I simply did not know how to stop the behavior. I was full of fear because this person was built like a San Francisco linebacker. And I'm 6'2" myself. I'm not a tiny guy. He was much bigger than me. And I felt like there would be retaliation. I knew I would get fired on the spot if I did anything. So this was not the impetus of me doing my research, but it's one of my personal stories that adds to the research that this happened to me. I also worked under a different destructive leader in a different town here in Minnesota. And she was incredibly manipulative in a fascinating way, very belittling. And yet she brought in so much money from donations. She was very successful as a development officer. On the other hand, she couldn't keep people working for her because she was so manipulative, putting people down all the time, making fun of them in public. There's no way that they could stay. So it was hard for her to keep people employed with her. Would anybody like to share one of their own stories with a destructive leader? No pressure. Mary Ellen.
You're making me think of, again, quite a few years ago, the University of St. Thomas wanted to do a conference on bad leaders, bad bosses. What does that look like? And they had to cancel it because there was such a strong element of fear. How do you ask a bad boss for funding to go to a conference on bad bosses? You know, and I think what you're referring to, because I included it when I was teaching at St. Mary's, this to me is very much of an ethical and a moral question that we do not provide anywhere, whether it's in business or education or nonprofits. We do not provide anywhere any kind of a safety mechanism within our organizations. As one student said to me when we were creating and discussing ethical issues, he said, Mary Ellen, frankly, I have 5 daughters. They like to eat. I have to send them to school. Okay. And there we see Enron, and we see a half a dozen other widely publicized issues that came up. It's an expectation that we want to set. However,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I had an example from where I, as a consultant, I was invited to come in to help an organization heal after a toxic leader, which, given your description of your 3 criteria, it was repetitive, it was systemic, and it was intentional. So he would probably be destructive in that sense. But the people were really traumatized by. He had rules that were so control and fear-based. One of them was the offices had to be completely clear, and there was only one picture on your desk at a 3x5 size of your family, only one. So you couldn't populate it with anything that personalized you. Another rule was laughter was not allowed in the organization. He used the metaphor of a library. It should be quiet like a library, and people should only speak with small, low voices, and anybody who laughed out loud got in trouble. And perfection was, if you had a typo in something you sent out, it was that people were belittled, and it was very stunning to listen to their stories of how they moved through. I'm really curious about the absence of policy or the absence of a protocol that you discovered in your interviews.
Yes, it's missing too much. And a lot of the bigger ones will have it. Like Alzheimer's Association would have that, and the American Cancer Society. But some of the smaller ones, including churches and community organizations, wouldn't have the policies necessary for
Mhm,
how to do an intervention.
mhm.
Sure, as well, even if you had the policies and the process in place, if there is a fear of culture, a culture of fear that's taken hold,
Yeah.
doesn't guarantee it'll be followed.
That's very, very true.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Not to mention if you're an introvert, if the
Mhm.
follower who's being belittled is an introvert, they will not have the strength, most likely, or the courage to stand up. So in that case, they need to find a trusted colleague who will stand for them or with them to
Mhm.
help them do what needs to be done.
Mhm. Mhm.
I
So
had
then-
an interesting example. I worked for a small company that had 3 offices in Europe, and I was in the smallest office. And when I joined the company, I was introduced to the head director in the office, and there was a office manager person and 2 other people that worked in the office, and then me. So there was just the 5 of us. And it took me a while to realize that the office manager was the director's wife. And because they weren't transparent about that at all. But the interesting dynamic was they were both what I would consider very destructive leaders. But he allowed her to, even though she wasn't my boss, he allowed her to give me the most ridiculous kinds of directives, and she would yell at me for ridiculous things. And, I came into that office as a seasoned professional, and she was treating me like I was literally a child. And she would, time how long I went to the bathroom. And so she would yell at me and she would belittle me, and she did it to the other people that worked in the office as well. But what I came to realize that, he was behind it. He was using her to control the office, because then when I would go to him and talk to him about things, he would talk to her behind my back. And it was just this very interesting dynamic that was so non-transparent that it just sort of broadsided me constantly. And I put up with it for about 7 or 8 months, and I was on the verge of leaving when they decided they were going to steal a bunch of clients and left themselves.
I'm sorry about all that.
And then tried to sue the company for what, I don't know, but it was it was interesting. And the owner of the company had no idea what was going on, and partly because the control was so great, he wouldn't allow us to talk to anybody in other offices because the owner of the company didn't work in our office. And it turned out that the company itself was also very toxic, and I think that's part of why he was allowed to get away with what he got away with.
Mhm.
But she wasn't a destructive leader. She was just incompetent and inept, and yeah, it was an interesting experience.
Mhm. And it still bothers you. I can see as you talk about it.
Yeah, it does. It just the thought of the whole thing just raises my blood pressure.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
David, can I
Yes.
ask you a question in
Yes.
terms of you interviewed nonprofit board only, or nonprofit board. Okay. So, there's the positional leaders that are our bosses, like that have that sort of managerial control over us, or right. Then there's these other settings that they're the leader and I'm the volunteer, or I don't work for them. Did you find any difference in people's responses to that and taking action against it, or was it across the board pretty much people didn't do much about it? I kind of saying, like, if I am the wage earner and I work for this destructive leader, I'm really not going to say anything because I need this job, or I'm going to see how long I can go. But if I'm somebody in a different department and I don't even report to that person at all, but I see what's going on, is there more likeliness that, is that a word, that I will, you know,
Yeah.
step up and say something,
Yeah.
or be a whistleblower, or.
Great question. In all of the interviews that I did, the destructive leaders were somehow directly in communication or in contact with the person that I was interviewing.
Okay.
So sometimes the destructive leader was the CEO of the organization, and sometimes it was a fellow board member or even the chair of the board. So I didn't interview with anybody who had, like, it was a step apart away from a destructive leader. It was more direct. But the research shows that people are simply not reporting it, even when they see it and when it's not a part of them. They simply don't know how. Yes. And even though almost 40% of Americans have been the victim of a destructive leader,
Wow.
high percentage. And that just shows you how much fear, like Shimmer was talking about, is a part of this. I'm working with an organization in Minneapolis where I met with the vice president, and there's another vice president who happens to be the vice president of HR, who's the destructive leader. And so the first vice president doesn't know what to do, you know, because you can't, she knows that if she talks to the second one, something's going to explode. So I said, well, why don't you invite me to come and talk in a group setting and make sure that this destructive leader is in there? And maybe as I talk about the different behaviors, they will see some of their behaviors and something might change. Research shows that that probably won't happen. So ultimately, this first vice president will probably have to do some sort of intervention, face forward resolution, you know, conflict management kind of thing with this person. But you can always try, first of all.
So
I love all of the things going on in the chat, but we're having good discussion here, so I'm going back and forth in my brain. So why do destructive leaders stay at an organization? Catherine, why do you think yours stayed for so long? And Kathy, why did yours continue to stay there and be destructive like that?
Because they have power.
They're allowed
And
to.
that's, yeah.
Yeah.
I think also I'm sorry, Heidi, I think in the times when I've gone in after a destructive leader to help organizations move on, there's something about the there's a relationship between hierarchical leadership, unbounded control and power, positional power. And I think the invitation, if you're predisposed, then you go down that path and start damaging the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Heidi, what were you going to say?
Well, so I spent over 20 years in local government, various local governments, and observed a number of just what I would call destructive leaders. And I think that there's a fear aspect, and I also think there's this equity aspect too, right? Because a lot of folks who might work under destructive leaders might be less able to risk the financial security of a job. And so they might be less likely to speak up. I also think that the people, particularly when I'm thinking about the environments I've been in local government, the council is really the ultimate authority, who are not necessarily sophisticated in terms of HR laws or leadership development or any of those things. And so if that leader, even if they're destructive, are getting the results those in power want, it's really easy to not quickly take action. You know, it's just, yeah, it's who ultimately has to take action. And that's not necessarily, the interests of those people are not necessarily aligned with the interests of the people who are working within the organization under the destructive leader.
Yes, that's the perfect picture of the double-edged sword right there. Mm-hmm. Jackie, did you want to add something?
No, I'm getting more and more curious about this because I've always thought that behaviors, I've made the assumptions, I have to say, that people learn these destructive behaviors from bad examples of leadership. And I don't understand how we can decide the difference between intentional and learned. I'm almost
Yeah.
I was wondering whether this is something that they're repeating as a matter of education. That's what they've learned to do, and they're repeating the errors or what they've been taught in practice. And also, what's coming up for me is the book I read on something called willful blindness. I don't know if you know Margaret Heffernan, and it's kind of that everybody knows it's happening, but nobody's saying anything because it's working in favor of the company for the moment. And how much of that is stopping people from stepping in? And sorry, but the third thing is, what does it take? Because I coach people in business who are experiencing very toxic leadership. And I suppose that's another one. Oh my God, all the questions are coming out here. What is the difference between toxic and destructive?
Lots of great questions. I love this. Let's see if I can answer all of them. Probably not in order. Well, maybe I won't. Yeah, I won't going to do it. The difference between destructive and toxic, those are interchangeable, kind of the same thing. I would say that toxic is a more contemporary, softer version of destructive for people who don't like to use destructive. It's brings to mind pollution rather than destruction, although that's not really, and then oh, Jackie, I loved all of your questions, but now I'm going to forget all of them. Can you tell I used to work for the Alzheimer's Association? Sorry, really bad joke. Let me go back to why do destructive leaders stay? And then I think that falls into the next thing that you were talking about. Oh, now I remember one of your questions. What creates a destructive leader? So now we're talking about the psychology of how a destructive leader is created. And I kind of stayed away from that since I focused on the business aspect of their behavior. But I can tell you there's two different things that usually happens that creates a destructive leader. Although this deserves a PhD project also, Mary Ellen, in case you want to go this way. One of them is how they were brought up. There's a lot of research on that. If they were brought up in a dysfunctional household, maybe they had their own trauma or abuse, and so that's what they know and that's what's normal to them. Then they can use that same type of behavior in a workforce setting. And the second is exactly what you talked about, learned behavior. There are two different types of followers of destructive leaders. And I'm not going to remember the names of both of them. One of them is called a colluder. The other one also starts with a C. I'd have to do a little bit more research on that. But there are followers of destructive leaders who see in some cases that the destructive leaders can be successful, like that development officer I know who brought in all the money. So then her followers, she's got a couple followers who practice what she preaches, copies what she does, and they are also very successful in working with donors and yet not successful in working with other people who report to them. Does that help a little bit?
Yep.
But there's a lot more research in that, Jackie, tons more.
Thank you.
Yeah. Mary Ellen.
I'm thinking of Janet Hagberg's book on power. And I'm working on the name. It's
Real Power.
Thank you. Because I also think the followers are complicit in the process of destructive leadership, in the sense that most of us have an expectation of power and a definition of power as being positional, transactional, and authoritative. Janet Hagberg looked at what else is power. And she went through 7 stages of that: wisdom, spirit, etc. And I think that becomes significant in that as you were saying, that destructive leader who brings in a lot of money is operating in an environment that says we value that.
Mm,
They
yeah.
are not valuing their employees and their sense of contribution, morality, participation. They are looking at a different set of values and belief systems.
Yeah.
So I think that becomes a very significant perspective for us when we're considering destructive leaders. Where is the organization's values? How has it been determined? It isn't merely a matter of reporting it. It isn't about accepting that there's a way to identify what that is. Those followers who accept that become, and I'm using the word again, complicit in this process because they accept it.
Yeah. Yeah.
The challenge becomes identifying that and enabling and empowering those people to be able to move beyond that.
100% right. Yeah.
So I think that's where our organizational environments become particularly significant, and we don't address that unless we're considering it from a regenerative perspective.
You could consider that a second gap in the practice. You're exactly right. And that goes hand in hand with some of the reasons that they stay, in that their behavior is the norm, like you're saying. So if that's the norm of the organization, then there's a values problem, right?
Yes. But I'm wondering, and this is a wonderment for me, is that a contributing factor to how employees, workers, us, are now changing jobs, careers about 13 times, 12 to 13 times? That's what's been identified. What is it that is causing people increasingly to change every 2 or 3 years?
Yeah.
Is this a reflection of what our organizations have become?
Yeah. Have you noticed any of the new research about millennials and Gen Ys and Gen Zs about how they are just not sticking around for this behavior?
Yeah,
exactly.
They won't put up with being yelled at.
That's
Or being manipulated, and they totally see when they're being manipulated or gaslighted or something, or if someone's taking credit for the work that they've done, they see it and they leave. Yeah.
But I pulled out a question that came up earlier by Jackie, and it was online. This was an online question. She had said, you know, can a destructive leader become aware of their behavior and change? Or did you hear any stories that happened?
Yeah, they can become aware. That doesn't mean that they will change their behavior, because again, it's part of their characteristic, their traits, right? Although I'm a positive thinker, so I like to think that they can change. I think anybody can change, but research shows that they most likely will not. So more often than not, they leave the organization sooner or later, whether they're helped out or they leave on their own accord. With just a few more minutes left, can I give you the 5 solutions that we found with the board members? I love this discussion. You guys, we could talk for hours. So 5 solutions. One of them is organizations need to create bylaws. We need some policies and procedures, some strategies for how to deal with the destructive leaders. How do we do the interventions? So that was the first one. The second one is training board members. Just because you're a board member doesn't mean you know how to be a board member, right? Frankly, just because you're a leader doesn't mean you know how to be a leader. And just like doctors get regular continuing education credits and teachers do continuing education, we really need to do continuing education with board members and leaders and other things. And I also believe personally that there are leaders on every level of an organization, not just the C-suite. The third one was incorporating an HR presence in the organization to help with those interventions if necessary. And I know some nonprofits are too small to have an HR department. In the state of Minnesota, there are actually, there's actually almost 40,000 nonprofits in the state of Minnesota alone. And you need to have a minimum of 3 members on your board in order to be qualified as a nonprofit. So there are just some small nonprofits that don't have an HR facet. And so then they need to get it from outside the organization. The fourth one was a surprising one to me. The board members all thought that we need to develop an alternate path of communication to report the behavior. So if your executive director is the destructive leader and you're a VP under that person, you don't want to go through that one to the board to report it. It's going to stop. So the board would like other avenues of communication for that to happen. And then the last one is, as you can see from some of the stories here, there is still trauma and fear, and there's emotional, psychological, mental abuse. People need help with that. On my website alone, I've got a separate site or page that I listed of therapists who specialize in destructive leaders in an organizational environment. And people need to talk about these things and get some of these things off of their shoulders.
Where is that list?
On my website, which I'll put in the chat here really quick.
That'd be good. That would be good.
I called my organization Langemo Leadership. Let's see here, Dale, where are you? Dale, do you know what that means? Long meadow. My last name in Norwegian means long meadow. Langemo is long meadow in Norwegian. So that's it. Lenny, yes.
Yeah, so those are 5 great points on dealing with the situation after it's already occurred. So what's the proactive stance? How do we prevent this to begin with? Right? Or else we're just fighting an invasive species.
It's really tough, isn't it? Because, oh my goodness, the one who was a really bad destructive leader that I worked under, he was amazing in his interview. Super charming, very charismatic. He did everything right. So it's tough. It's going to be tough to find those. There are certain psychological exams that people can take that aren't meant to be exam-like. There isn't a super good answer for that, Lenny, at this point. Yeah. Hopefully.
Your next
nowadays we're not, a lot of companies are getting rid of the calling for references. They're not doing that anymore. And yet, what would happen if they did call for references?
Yeah.
I don't know. I've
Kathy,
taken
you're
up
muted.
far too much of your time, but thank you
Yeah.
for letting me talk today.
I think I haven't answered to Lenny's proactive
Sure.
question, which is, I think it might invite a question into culture may be the strongest mechanism because it operates so much like a force field. And we know culture can reinforce destructive leadership. So what are the conditions under which culture does not support destructive leadership? What behaviors would be modeled? What feedback mechanisms would be present to that would dampen it down? In my experience, destructive leadership almost always shows up when feedback to that person and the holistic implications of their actions are dampened down or ignored in an organization. So that might invite a feedback-rich, proactive stance in some way, shape, or form. For example, I am sorry, but I need to speak for another call. So
Yeah, I agree with Kathy.
Yeah, so lovely, folks. Sorry, I have to go.
Goodbye, Kathy. Thank you.
Kathy, you are the recording button, however. So why don't you, I don't know, you could just
I'll stop recording and then we'll go.
Thank you. But I'll wrap us up, yeah, in a minute, couple minutes.